The ship shuddered as the last of the asteroid field loomed into view. Voran Aldous tightened his grip on the control panel, sweat beading on his forehead, though the ship's cooling system worked at full capacity. His breath came in steady bursts, a low rasp that betrayed the pressure mounting inside him. Outside the viewports, the inky blackness of space was speckled with the fractured remains of rocks, dust, debris, a reminder of the chaotic environment he had fought through in the past few days. The alert chime sounded again, this time more insistent. Critical systems damage detected. Hull integrity at 45%. Evacuate immediately. Shut it down. I'm not going anywhere, Aldous muttered, flicking the switches one by one, each motion more desperate than the last. His mind raced through the calculations. Escape pods weren't an option. Not with the terrain below. The planet was hostile, the environment lethal, but it was his only chance. Another tremor passed through the vessel, this one stronger than before. He had seen worse. He had lived through worse. His legs burned from exhaustion as he stood up from his seat and staggered toward the rear hatch. Outside, the planet called to him with its harsh, unforgiving pull. On the surface of the planet, the terrain was a vast expanse of jagged rock, volcanic fissures, and oceans of liquid sulfur. Voran Aldous staggered as he set foot on the barren soil, each step making the ground crunch under his boots. The atmosphere was thick with toxic gases, and the sky above boiled with clouds of storm rage. Lightning cracked violently in the distance, followed by the sound of thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the planet. His hands shook as he activated the beacon, sending out a distress signal, though he knew no one would be coming. The Council wouldn't care. They had seen humans as a curiosity at best, a species to be tolerated, but never truly feared. They had labeled humanity as mid-worlders, a species with no true claim to the stars. How wrong they had been. Aldous wiped the sweat from his brow, eyes narrowing against the bitter sting of the acid in the air. The planet would kill him eventually. That much was certain. But it wouldn't be today. His body, pushed to the edge, fought back with a strength he had no right to possess. He had come prepared for the worst. And though the odds were impossible, he had no intention of letting this planet claim him without a fight. It had been 2 days since the crash. By now his body had adjusted to the conditions. His stomach growled. Hunger gnawed at him, a reminder that he was still alive. He had constructed a makeshift shelter out of materials scavenged from his ship, something to shield him from the torrential downpours. His eyes, bloodshot and burning, stayed sharp, watching the skies for the storm to subside. The planet had been abandoned by nearly every species that had attempted to colonize it. Too many lost ships, too many failures. No one, not even the galaxy's most hardened warriors, had dared stay. And yet here he was, thriving in the same place that had consumed others. His skin had adjusted to the temperature extremes, his lungs filtering the air as he learned to anticipate the shifts in the atmosphere. He had no choice. And then the predators arrived. It began with the distant growl of something large, something close to the ground, but terrifying in its presence. The first ripple in the air, a tremor that shook the planet's crust, was all the warning Aldous had. The claws of the Karvak, the apex predator of this hellish world, dug into the soil with terrifying precision, its massive jaws snapping hungrily. It wasn't hunting for food. It was hunting for the only thing left on this forsaken planet. Survival. And Aldous was a very convenient target. The Karvak lunged from the shadows of the rock outcropping, its jaws snapping, teeth glinting in the flashes of lightning above. But Aldous had already anticipated the move. As the beast's weight descended toward him, he darted to the left, his body moving on pure instinct. A sickening crack echoed as the predator's fangs hit nothing but rock. He had been prepared for the attack. His weapon, an improvised harpoon, constructed from scrap metal and powered by his makeshift energy cells, struck true. The harpoon pierced the Karvok's side, embedding deeply into its thick hide. The creature howled in pain and fury, thrashing wildly. But it was too late. Aldous wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning to fight back. Hours later, when the storm subsided, Aldous was standing victorious over the Karvok's lifeless body, the rain dripping from his hair, the flesh of the beast already beginning to rot in the heat. He wiped his blood-slicked hands on his pants, his gaze unblinking, his eyes cold, detached. This world would have killed anyone else by now, but it hadn't killed him, and it wouldn't. He knew something the Council didn't. He had a secret, one they would never see coming. The human species, so underestimated by every other race in the galaxy, had more than brute force to rely on. They had ingenuity. They had the ability to adapt, evolve, and survive. On Earth, they had lived with disasters, conflicts, and environments so harsh they had become nothing less than Deathworlders in their own right. The Council had underestimated them. They had called them weak, primitive. But soon, humanity would show them exactly what it meant to be more than a footnote in the history of the galaxy. Aldous was only the beginning. Humanity had always been capable of more than anyone could imagine. Back in the core of the galaxy, the news of Aldous' survival was filtering through the Council's channels. The emergency meeting had been called. Panic had already set in. Humanity, a species they had once deemed unworthy of respect, was showing signs of an unprecedented survival instinct. Could they really be this dangerous? The Council didn't know it yet, but the first question had been asked. Are humans really Deathworlders? In the vast silence of space, far beyond the sight of any Council member, a new chapter of galactic history had begun. Voran Aldous was the spark that would ignite a war no one saw coming. As the storm clouds of the galaxy began to darken, humanity's place was about to be tested. An adaptation of nature's cruelest lesson: survive or be crushed underfoot. The Council would soon learn that the human species was not something to be feared, but something to be reckoned with. In the moments before the chaos would truly unfold, Aldous stood in his makeshift shelter, the storm finally passing. He looked to the horizon, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a small smile. The galaxy wouldn't see it coming, and they would pay the price for it. Aldous knelt by the fire he had kindled from the remains of the Karvok, its body now charred and blackened in the shifting winds. The smoke curled upward, thick and pungent, filling the air with the taste of ash. His fingers, raw from the harshness of the environment, gently traced the rough-hewn edges of the weapon he'd used to bring down the beast. The storm had passed, but the landscape still seemed to seethe with menace. The winds carried a faint hum now, not of engines, but the shifting cry of a world alive with danger, a planet that had no mercy for the unprepared. He could feel the ground beneath him trembling, its pulse quickening in time with his own heartbeat. The Karvok had been only the first. Aldous had learned long ago to respect the wildness of this world, and this encounter had only deepened that understanding. He had no illusion that he would be the last to feel its fury. In the distance, the ruined hull of his ship stood like a skeletal monument to his tenacity, a silent witness to the destruction that had claimed the rest of the fleet. The crash had been brutal, a consequence of his own desperation as he tried to evade a sudden gravitational anomaly. Yet now, as he stood in the shadows of his wreckage, he found it almost poetic, the way survival always seemed to find its way through the cracks of failure. Back on the home front, the Galactic Council had already begun to feel the first tremors of uncertainty ripple through their ranks. It wasn't just Aldous' miraculous survival they were concerned with. A single human, stranded on a hostile world, surviving against all odds. It could have been an isolated case, a fluke. But the news was only the beginning. Humanity was showing a pattern of behavior that no one had expected. The reports were flooding in now, reaching the Council's chambers. Miran, the Volnir diplomat, was the first to speak out. Her voice, calm yet laced with a subtle tension, echoed in the Council's chambers, a room where decades of galactic peace had been negotiated and maintained. "We've underestimated them," she said, her words cutting through the stillness of the chamber. "Not just their survival instincts, but their capacity for adaptation." Around her, murmurs rippled through the Council's various representatives. Tiber, the Zinnak warlord, leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing. "What do you suggest, Moran? That we just sit and wait? Allow this anomaly, to become a threat to everything we've built?" "No," Moran responded, holding his gaze. "But we can no longer ignore the growing signs that humanity may possess a capability we haven't seen in any other species." Aldous sat, crouched against the jagged stone formations near his shelter, running his fingers over the rock surface. His mind was elsewhere, moving through the latest scans he'd conducted with the limited technology at his disposal. His fingers bled as he manipulated the alien components he'd scavenged from his ship, forming a rudimentary yet effective system. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. The galaxy had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt. It would soon see how wrong it had been. His only company was the constant rustling of the wind and the occasional rumble of the ground beneath him, a reminder of the planet's volatile nature. But it wasn't the weather that concerned him. He was alone on this world, but he wasn't entirely out of reach. Far above, the stars were still the same, silent, uncaring. Yet down here, in the shadow of a dying ship, humanity's destiny was being forged in silence. Back on the Council's flagship, the scene was chaotic. Kasha, the Rithian strategist, stood at the helm of an emergency meeting, her eyes scanning the gathered delegates. "What are we truly dealing with here?" she asked, her tone cutting through the tension. "This is no longer a matter of military engagement or diplomacy. This is about something more primal. We are facing a force that we have no understanding of. There's no way they've developed this on their own," Nekthor, the Krath ambassador, sneered. "These are primitive creatures, their ships, their weapons. They must have stolen them." "Does it matter?" Kasha shot back. "Their capacity for survival, their ingenuity. How are we going to control that? We can't even predict their next move." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "We cannot afford to underestimate them." Aldous' shelter had become more than just a makeshift refuge. It was a testament to his will. He had fashioned a device to filter the air, a system he knew would keep him alive longer than anyone expected. He hadn't expected to make it this far, but now that he had, he felt a shift within himself, a deep-seated certainty. Humanity was not just surviving on this planet. They were proving a point, and the galaxy would soon have to reckon with that. The day was drawing to a close. The sky, a swirling mass of roiling clouds, began to darken once more, signaling the return of the storms. Aldous didn't flinch. He had been on this planet long enough to know its rhythms. The storm would pass, just like all the others. But it wouldn't change the fact that he had learned how to survive in a way no other species could. His eyes narrowed as he gazed into the storm, his mind racing through tactical options. A battle was coming. The Council would come for him eventually, and when they did, they would be in for a surprise. He had no illusions about humanity's position in the galaxy. They were seen as weak, insignificant, but that was about to change. He knew that now. Back in the Council chambers, the discussion had grown heated. Tiber slammed his fist onto the table. "We've lost control. There's no way they'll comply with our demands. We need to strike them before they grow too powerful." "No." Kasha's voice rang with the weight of authority. "A preemptive strike could push them into a corner. We need to understand them first." "But how?" Nekthor's voice was sharp, filled with disdain. "You really think these creatures are worth our time? We've seen enough. They're a threat." The debate continued, but Kasha's words lingered in the room, settling heavily. A threat or an opportunity? The storm had reached its peak. Aldous, eyes locked on the darkening sky, gritted his teeth. His pulse quickened as the wind screamed across the barren landscape, tearing at the remnants of his shelter. His mind was a maze of strategies, each one more daring than the last. Humanity had never been the aggressor. They had been underestimated, ignored. But the Council was about to learn that survival was more than a matter of brute strength. As the winds howled and the ground rumbled beneath him, Aldous made a decision. He wasn't going to just survive. He was going to change the galaxy's perception of humanity, one strike at a time. And when the Council finally arrived, they would find that their greatest enemy wasn't humanity's weapons or tactics. It was humanity's refusal to yield. The storm had passed, but the atmosphere remained suffocating, thick with the tension of a battle not yet fought. Aldous crouched low against the jagged rocks. The last few days had been a blur of survival and makeshift engineering, but now the battle for humanity's place in the galaxy was no longer a distant possibility. It was a reality that was drawing closer, and Aldous could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. The sky above was an angry swirl of black clouds and flickers of distant lightning. It was a storm that carried more than just the usual promise of danger. It felt like the planet itself was preparing for something. But it wasn't the storm that unnerved him. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence that gripped the soul and made every movement, every decision, seem like the most important one. Aldous slowly ran his fingers over the device in his hand, a makeshift communication unit crafted from the wreckage of his ship. He had spent hours refining it, manipulating pieces of alien technology and his own Earth-based tools. The hum of the device was faint, yet it carried a certainty in its steady pulse. The Council would be watching soon. They had no choice but to come for him now, to see firsthand what humanity had become. As he adjusted the frequency, the quiet crackling of static was replaced by a voice he had hoped to avoid. "Voran Aldous, we know you're listening," said Miran, the Volnir diplomat. Her voice was calm, calculated. "We know what you've done, and we need to speak with you." Aldous didn't reply immediately. He let the silence hang between them for a moment, savoring the feeling of control. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Miran," he said finally, his voice low, tinged with weariness. "What do you want from me?" There was a long pause, and for a moment Aldous thought she might not respond. Then her voice cracked through the silence again, this time colder, sharper. "We want to understand. We need to understand how one human has been able to survive here, and why you're still here at all. You have to know that this is more than just a question of survival. This is a question of the galaxy's future. Your species has shown a potential we cannot ignore." The words hung in the air like a slow drip of water, each syllable weighing more than the last. Aldous exhaled slowly, his mind spinning with the implications. Miran wasn't here to negotiate. She was here to understand, and if she had her way, she would bring the galaxy to bear on humanity's survival. "I'm here because I don't have a choice," Aldous replied quietly, his gaze drifting over the desolate landscape. "But you're wrong if you think this is about survival. It's about something else, something you won't understand until you see it for yourself. Humanity isn't just here to survive. We're here to prove we can thrive, and that's something the galaxy will never expect." The Council was fractured.
Back aboard the flagship, debates had turned from discussions of diplomacy to cold, hard calculations. Kasha, the Rithian strategist, paced back and forth, her mind working faster than anyone else in the room. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of an uncertain future pressing on her shoulders. Her people had always been pragmatic, but they weren't blind. The reports about humanity's resilience, its ability to adapt and overcome, had left them questioning everything they thought they knew about the galaxy. And now humanity was showing them something far more dangerous than just survival. Are we going to continue playing this game of diplomacy? Tiber, the Zinnik warlord, growled, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. I say we strike now, before they become a real threat. Strike how? Kasha snapped, stopping her pacing to face him. We don't even know the extent of their capabilities. We only know what they've chosen to show us, and from what I've seen, we're missing something crucial here. Tiber's eyes narrowed, and he slammed his fist on the table. Missing something, they're an unknown quantity. And when you're dealing with something like that, you don't wait for it to show its teeth. You destroy it before it can bite. But Moran, seated nearby, interrupted. We can't be rash, she said softly. This isn't just a threat. This is an opportunity. We need to understand them first. Humanity has been given a chance to prove its worth. It's a test for all of us. And what happens if they fail? Tiber asked, his voice edged with impatience. They won't, Moran replied. There was no doubt in her words, no hesitation. We've underestimated them for too long. Back on the planet's surface, the air had grown thick again with the incoming storm. Eoldis's makeshift shelter was little more than a crude structure of metal and alien tech, but it had kept him alive. He wasn't certain how much longer he could stay hidden, how much longer he could wait for the Council to make its move. But he knew one thing, he couldn't hide forever. His mind raced through the possibilities, weighing the risks and rewards of his next move. And then the ground began to tremble. It was subtle at first, a slight vibration underfoot, but it grew, a tremor that rippled through the planet's crust. He straightened, eyes narrowing as he felt the shift in the atmosphere. Something was coming. He didn't need the sensors to tell him. He could feel it. The Council was closer than ever before. Aldous stood still, watching the shifting horizon. The sky, once dark and roiling, was now streaked with a deep, ominous red. The storm was still a few hours away, but something else had stirred, a different kind of danger. His heart beat faster, as the ground beneath him began to rumble louder. Far above, the Council had made its decision. The fleets were mobilizing. Humanity's fate would be decided in the next few days, and the first assault was already in motion. Kasha stood at the observation window, watching as the massive ships prepared for the journey. She wasn't sure what she would find on the surface, or if she would even find Aldous, but there was one thing she knew for sure. The galaxy was changing, and humanity would either be its salvation or its downfall. The thought gnawed at her, relentless in its weight. Would humanity be able to navigate the labyrinth of galactic politics and survive the coming war? Or would the Council, in its fear and ignorance, push them into a corner where there would be no way out? As the fleet prepared to depart, Kasha turned away from the window, her mind already working through the next steps. There would be no easy answers, but the clock was ticking, and in the chaos that was sure to follow, there would be no going back. The ground continued to shake beneath Aldous' feet, and he could hear the distant hum of engines growing louder. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol of humanity's defiance, and the Council was coming for him. Whole. But what would they find? A man who had survived against the odds, or something far more dangerous than they ever imagined? The storm was coming for them all. Aldous watched the horizon split open with the approach of alien ships, massive behemoths, their silhouettes cutting through the thickening smoke of battle. The air tasted of dust and burnt metal, the remnants of his traps, his preparations. He had anticipated this moment. The Council would come, and they would see humanity not as the fragile species they had dismissed, but as the force that could reshape the stars. He adjusted the makeshift bandage on his wrist, the harsh fabric pulling tight against his skin. His hand trembled slightly, but not from fear. The battle raged below him, and it was no longer just a fight for survival. It was the last test for humanity's place in the galaxy. No more running, no more hiding. The Council had forced their hand, and now humanity was about to show them what it meant to fight with everything they had. The ground beneath him rumbled with the force of the incoming fleet. He didn't look back at the shipwrecks strewn across the barren wasteland. There was no time to dwell. The war was now a living thing, one that breathed in time with his own pulse, racing faster with each step toward his goal. Behind him, the remnants of his human forces rallied, ready to face an overwhelming enemy. They had nothing left to lose, but that gave them something few others had, the drive to win no matter the cost. On the command ship, Kasha stood at the center of a room that felt too small for the weight of the moment. Her eyes flicked over the holographic display, showing the human fleet's position on the outskirts of the battlefield. The data was chaotic, ships darting through the sky with impossible maneuvers, weaving in and out of the alien forces. The humans were outgunned, outnumbered, but their actions defied all logic. They weren't fighting to survive, they were fighting to win, and that was something Kasha hadn't expected. "There's no strategy here," Tiber muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "They're reacting, not planning. They're running blind." Kasha's gaze lingered on the human formation. The chaos of the battle spoke of something deeper than simple survival. Their ships were small, agile, and used every corner of the environment to their advantage. They weren't just surviving, they were turning the battlefield into a weapon. "If that's true," Kasha said, her voice sharp, "then they're winning by making us underestimate them." She clenched her fist, the realization settling in. "They're adapting faster than we can think." Aldous darted between rocky outcrops, his breath steady despite the growing adrenaline. His mind was a flurry of calculations, each move predetermined in the fractions of a second before he made it. The alien forces advanced, confident in their strength, but he saw the cracks in their formation. Their ships had the firepower, but they didn't understand the terrain, didn't understand that in the end, it was humanity's mind that would tip the scales. His fingers brushed the control panel on his wrist, and the next wave of traps went live. A sudden explosion rocked the ground behind him, sending debris flying into the air. Aldous didn't flinch. He had no time for fear. The enemy was advancing, but the true fight had only just begun. The world was changing around him, and humanity would force the galaxy to notice. The earth beneath him rumbled again, but this time it was no longer a distant tremor. The first of the enemy's heavy walkers had touched down. The ground shook violently with each step, the massive machines stomping forward, their weapons primed and ready to tear apart anything in their path. Aldous knew the walkers were just the beginning. He could hear the hum of their weapons systems powering up, the metallic grind of their movement cutting through the chaos of battle. The plan was simple: survive long enough to create enough damage that the Council would have no choice but to reconsider everything they thought they knew about humanity. The walkers, however, were a problem. They were nearly indestructible, but Aldous had never fought fair, and he wasn't about to start now. In the Council's flagship, Mirren paced back and forth. Her voice cut through the tense atmosphere in the command center. "What are we waiting for? We need to finish this now." But the tension in her words was undeniable. The more she watched, the more she understood. These humans weren't the cornered animals she had believed them to be. They were something else entirely. They weren't going to beg for mercy. They were going to force the galaxy to understand their power. Nekthor, the Krath warlord, stood rigidly by the command table, his eyes locked on the live feeds from the battlefield. "We can't let them take control. If we don't strike now, there may be nothing left to salvage. They're using the terrain to their advantage. We're being drawn in, piece by piece." Mirren turned on him, her eyes flaring with urgency. "If we keep pushing, we risk pushing them too far. They won't just fight back, they'll fight to win. We've seen that already." Aldous watched the first walker descend into the trap he had set. His fingers moved with lightning speed as he activated the remote triggers. The ground beneath the machine cracked open, and a series of explosive devices went off, sending plumes of dust and debris into the air. The walker stumbled, its massive frame swaying before crashing to the ground in a deafening explosion. The first victory was his, but it was just the beginning. He could hear the sound of more walkers approaching, their weapons still aimed at him, ready to erase the threat he posed. "Is that all you've got?" he muttered under his breath. The question wasn't for them, it was for the galaxy. He knew the truth now. Humanity didn't need to rely on the weapons of others. Humanity had always been a force in and of itself, a species that had learned how to survive not just through strength, but through cunning, resourcefulness, and an unwillingness to back down. As the battle raged on, Aldous moved with unrelenting purpose. The alien forces were regrouping, their movements growing more coordinated as they realized that their overwhelming strength wasn't enough. The human forces were using guerrilla tactics, disappearing into the terrain and striking with deadly accuracy. They weren't just surviving, They were winning. The sky above began to clear, the storm passing over the battlefield. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The battle was far from over, but humanity had proven something undeniable. The Council could not ignore them. Humanity would not be crushed. They would not be subjugated. They would rise back on the flagship. Kasha and Tiber stood in silence, watching the final moments of the battle unfold. The data feeds showed the damage, the retreat of their forces, the slow realization that humanity had taken the upper hand. The war was not yet won, but the first strike had been delivered, and it had shattered their expectations. This isn't over. Tiber growled, his hands clenched into fists. But it's clear now. We have to change our approach. Kasha looked out across the battlefield, her mind racing. Yes, she said, her voice quieter now, but no less determined. But humanity has made it clear. They're not just fighting for survival, they're fighting for their future. The battle had taken its toll, but Aldous stood tall. The horizon before him was scarred with the remnants of the Council's assault, but humanity had claimed this ground. His voice carried over the comms, a final message to the galaxy. This is who we are humanity, and we're not going anywhere. The storm had passed, but a new kind of reckoning was coming. The galaxy would soon realize that humanity was no longer an afterthought. It was the force that would redefine everything, and nothing would stop them from claiming their place in the stars. The battlefield was silent, save for the crackling of distant fires, the low groan of twisted metal, and the slow, heavy steps of human survivors moving across the ruin. Aldous stood at the heart of the devastation, his eyes scanning the horizon where the last of the alien forces retreated, their once imposing ships dwindling into specks against the bruised sky. The storm had finally cleared, leaving a world scarred but unbroken. Humanity had weathered it, and now they were shaping the future. The air smelled of burnt earth and scorched metal. The silence was not peace, but an uneasy stillness before the inevitable storm of what came next. Humanity had made its mark, but there was more to this battle than just survival. They had not only fought for their right to exist, they had fought to prove that they were no longer the underdogs. They were the future. Kasha stood on the command deck of the flagship, her eyes fixed on the planet below. Her mind raced, replaying every move, every second of the battle. The human forces had done the impossible, and now the truth was undeniable. Humanity was a force unlike any other species, a species that could adapt, survive, and thrive under the harshest conditions. Her fingers clenched around the rail before her, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "We've miscalculated," she murmured under her breath. Beside her, Tiber remained silent, his eyes hard, but his expression betraying a flicker of something else, respect. "No more underestimating them," he said, the words thick with finality. "Not after this." The thought lingered in the air like an unspoken agreement. They had all believed humanity to be weak, something to be crushed underfoot. But what they had witnessed in those final moments was not weakness. It was the stubborn, burning will to endure and to overcome. On the planet's surface, Aldous surveyed the battlefield, the remnants of the Council's forces scattered like broken toys across the cracked earth. The air was heavy with the aftermath, the scent of burnt electronics and scorched soil thick in his lungs. His heart pounded, but it was not fear that drove him now. It was something far deeper, something primal. The Council had thrown everything they had at humanity, and humanity had fought back with everything they had in return. But it wasn't just their weapons that made the difference. It was their spirit. Aldous moved through the wreckage, each step carrying the weight of the battle, of the blood spilled, of the cost of survival. His comrades were gathering, tending to the wounded, salvaging whatever they could from the wreckage. But Aldous knew they were not just survivors. They were now something far more dangerous. They were the architects of their own future. "Voran," a voice called out behind him. It was Dahlia, one of his tactical officers, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes bright with the spark of victory. "We did it. We actually did it." Aldous nodded, though he didn't smile. The victory felt hollow in the face of so much loss. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice grim. "The Council won't give up that easily. They'll come back, and when they do, we'll be ready." Dahlia looked at him, her expression shifting from exhilaration to something else, understanding, perhaps even fear. "What do you mean?" "The battle is only beginning," Aldous replied, turning to face her. Humanity doesn't just survive. We adapt, we fight, and we conquer. This was only the first step. Back in the council chambers, Moran stood alone, staring at the holographic display. The map of the galaxy had changed. The human forces had done the impossible, and now the balance of power was in flux. The council had been forced to recognize something they had never wanted to acknowledge. Humanity was not just another species among many. They were a force that could not be ignored. She turned away from the display, her mind spinning with the implications. They had underestimated humanity. They had thought them weak, primitive, but now she knew the truth. Humanity was not merely a species that had survived. They were a species that had overcome, and that made them the most dangerous force in the galaxy. But Moran wasn't the only one who had been forced to reckon with this new reality. Nekthor, the Krath warlord, had watched the battle unfold with growing trepidation. His race had always been known for their brutality, their ability to dominate, to crush, but what had happened on that planet had made him question everything he had ever known. "They're not what we thought they were," he admitted to Lether, the Galactic Council head. "They're not just surviving, they're taking control." Lether nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's more than survival. They are rewriting the rules. We have no choice now but to accept it." Aldis stood atop a ridge, watching as the last of the alien forces disappeared into the sky, leaving behind only the desolate landscape of a planet caught between destruction and rebirth. His mind was calm now, focused on the future. The war had been won, but the real challenge was yet to come. The galaxy had witnessed humanity's power, but it was not just the strength of their will that would determine their fate. It was how they would use that strength. "We've won," Dahlia said, standing beside him. "But what happens now?" Aldis didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft golden light over the ruined battlefield. "Now," he said slowly, "we show them that this wasn't a fluke. We show them that humanity doesn't just fight to survive, we fight to thrive." Back in the heart of the galaxy, the council gathered once more. Their decision was final. Humanity had proven itself, and in that proof they had set in motion a new era, one where they were no longer seen as weak or insignificant, but as a species that had the strength to rise above and shape the future. Kasha looked around at the faces of the other delegates, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, fear, and reluctant respect. "The question," she said, her voice cutting through the silence, "is not whether we can control them, but whether we are ready to live in a galaxy where humanity has a place." Tiber, standing across from her, finally spoke, his voice low and heavy with the weight of what had transpired. "They're not just another species, they're the ones who will change everything." As the council fell into uneasy silence, Kasha looked toward the stars, the realization sinking in. Humanity had proven that they would not be contained. They had shown that their future was theirs to shape, and no one, not the council, nor any force in the galaxy, could deny them their place. The galaxy had learned its lesson. Humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. They were the new rulers of their destiny.